afternoon and welcome to February's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you all so much for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting presentation. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to join the stream and then we'll get things started. Hello, thanks for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to give our friends just a few more minutes to join the stream. Thank you so much for your patience. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maddie McCauley, and I work here in the Programs and Outreach Department of Enoch Pratt Free Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Before we get things started, I'd like to indicate that should you have any questions or comments for our presenter today, please put them into the chat or comment section of the video, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archive. Take it away, Owen.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Owen Lurie, the Outreach Coordinator at the Maryland State Archives. The State Archives holds records of permanent value of the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. And these Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity to hear stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source material and the value of archives in uncovering shared heritage. Our presentation today comes from Elizabeth Anderson Comer and is entitled Using DNA to Connect Living People to Enslaved Ironworkers at Catoctin Furnace, about successful efforts to trace the ancestry of enslaved African Americans who worked at the iron foundry, which began operations in the 1770s. It's a really tremendous amount of research. If you are interested in exploring our records for your own research, I hope that you will come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. I hope that you will join us next month on March 13th, when Savannah G.M. Wood, Executive Director of Afro Charities, will talk about the rich and voluminous archival holdings of the Afro newspaper, as well as their new planned archives building. You can find a full list of programs, including videos of past presentations, on our website. You can, of course, find many more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. And now, to introduce today's speaker, here's Bert Kummerow, Founding Director of the Maryland 4 Centuries Project.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome all to our Midwinter Lunch and Learn lecture. Today's subject demonstrates that our Lunch and Learn partnership can bring new, exciting research in Maryland's history to our shared public. The Catoctin Furnace is an important part of the Maryland Mosaic. It's a program that we at the Maryland 4 Centuries Project developed to focus on events and people who were both first in Maryland and, more important, in the nation. The Catoctin Furnace is a mosaic piece in Frederick County, one of the 150 other pieces in all 23 counties and Baltimore City. You can see the entire statewide mosaic on our website at www.marylandmosaic.org. There you can read about why Catoctin was included both as a first in Maryland and in the nation. The 250 Maryland Commission has adopted the mosaic as part of its 2026 anniversary plans. The Commission is enlisting mosaic partners, those institutions that can best tell the story of each of the mosaic pieces. The Catoctin Furnace Historical Society is indeed one of those statewide partners, making our local history and its importance come to life for us. The Catoctin Furnace Historic Site has two important stories to tell. The first paints a picture of industry in the early U.S. Before the steel blast furnaces of Pittsburgh and Birmingham, there were charcoal-fired iron furnaces in the forests of Maryland and Pennsylvania. These wood-hungry furnace communities produced cast iron stoves, cannons and cannonballs, and iron rails for the new railroads. A visit to the recreated Hopewell Village National Park near Reading, Pennsylvania, will provide a portrait of a large, active community of laborers, often working around the clock during one of the long blasts in the furnace that produced the molten iron. The workers who face that backbreaking work at the furnaces get us to the main subject of today's talk. Pennsylvania had an immigrant labor population, but Maryland, a slave state, had enslaved workers. Among the several Maryland furnaces, Catoctin produced its iron with generations of slaves, all but erased by history. The fate of those enslaved workers leads to the second story at Catoctin. I remember passing the overgrown stone and brick ruin on Route 15 years ago. That lonely stack was all that remained of a thriving furnace community. Our speaker today, archaeologist Elizabeth Comer, has found a way to bring the lost story of Catoctin Furnace back to center stage. Many of us in our jobs have faced the dilemma of what to do with a forgotten burial ground discovered during an archaeological dig. When they found unmarked burials at the site of the old furnace, Elizabeth and her colleagues went to work to do what they could to identify the remains. They quickly discovered that they were working in an African-American burial ground. New scientific breakthroughs, especially through DNA analysis, make it possible to discover much more about these lost souls. The skeletal remains show many effects of the unrelenting hard work of operating an iron furnace. The biggest breakthrough, however, came with DNA. This science unearthed relationships between the Catoctin workers and their descendants, even with us today, thus giving these burials back to their family identities. Distinguished Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., producer of the popular PBS show Finding Your Roots, called all of this groundbreaking. We are lucky to have the individual here today who brought the Catoctin Furnace community back to life and turned its history into a national story. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Comer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that amazing introduction. to our research at Catoctin. And I have to say, this is my favorite part of my volunteer job at Catoctin Furnace, sharing the research that we've been able to undertake with the public. And of course, in that process of sharing, there's always the new door that opens for a new descendant or that has identified their connection with Catoctin, or a new colleague working with us. So thank you for allowing me to share with you today for a few minutes the result of 13 years of research that has come to fruition, but not yet finished, is the best way to describe it. So as you know, Catoctin Furnace is located in Western Maryland, in Frederick County, northern Frederick County. And that is an area that, just by many accidents of history, I grew up there. My family went to the little church in the village and became very interested in the history. And 53 years ago now, they and 3 other couples started the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society as an activist organization to save it from the planned destruction or negative impact, maybe would be a better way to say it, of the construction of Route 15. So fast forward, I became an archaeologist and working as the first archaeologist in the city of Baltimore, and I still do archaeology throughout the area located in Baltimore. But my love of Catoctin Furnace and my attempt to carry on the research legacy of my parents and the other individuals who started the Historical Society takes me to Catoctin Furnace at least once a week and gives me the opportunity to work with an amazing team that has come together to get past that brick wall of African American history and tell the full story, the whole truth of Catoctin Furnace and skilled enslaved ironworkers. In August of 2023, this research hit the apex, if you will, of its ability to reach other people with the publication of a Science lead article entitled "The Genetic Legacy of African Americans from Catoctin Furnace." And in that article, this large team demonstrated that it was possible for the first time to wed the power of massive direct-to-consumer ancestry databases with ancient DNA. I started 13 years ago working with Ancestry.com, but then by, again, an accident of history, I ended up finding out that 23andMe, through a connection with Harvard University, was interested in pouring vast amounts of money and time into developing a new protocol that we could use at Catoctin called IDB, or Identical by Descent. The cover of the Science magazine, and I worked with this amazing artist at Science to come up with this, it's the names of 271 of the enslaved skilled ironworkers at Catoctin, emanating from the double helix structure of the DNA. And the names, the 271 names that you see there, are the result of countless hours of research at the Maryland State Archives, at Heritage Frederick, in the Enoch Pratt, and everywhere that we could find historical records of wills and deeds, land records, probate, diaries, ecclesiastical records at the Diocese of Maryland, and everywhere else we could find. And that is how we came up with those initial 271 names, all unfortunately first names, which of course, as you can imagine, makes it very difficult to trace and the African-American genealogy, and again, get over what Henry Louis Gates calls that brick wall of African-American genealogy. So enter DNA. So using the first reliable approach for identifying identical by descent connections between present day and historical people, we compared the DNA of 27 African Americans who labored at Catoctin Furnace during the late 18th and early 19th centuries to that of more than 9 million research participants in the 23andMe database. So the key findings are that we identified 41,799 modern relatives. Now, and of those, 2,975 are extremely close and are likely direct descendants. So that would be grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother, that sort of very close connection. And the 41,799 are collateral or deep time connections, but still connected, a very important point for us. We traced enslaved people's origins in Africa, because the 23andMe database, like other direct consumer databases, contains the information that has been put into the database by individuals throughout the world, including, of course, people who present day live in Africa. And by sampling DNA from historical people with closer ties to Africa, we showed that the enslaved workers at Catoctin derive from a small number of African groups, particularly the Wolof of West Africa and the Congo of Central Africa. We restored personal stories. And this is really the thing that just is so amazing to me. So within the Catoctin Furnace Cemetery, we identified 5 genetic families. So basically we were doing, locational information analysis within the cemetery. And these families were primarily mothers, children, and siblings who were buried close together in the cemetery. Something that the DNA was able to provide, that sort of detailed information. And finally, we offered methods of communicating with descendants. We developed protocols to inform descendants and provide critical information, support, and counseling. So how did this begin? When Catoctin Furnace, as Bert was saying, starts at the time of the Revolution, just a few years prior, actually, and operates up until 1903. We never made steel at Catoctin, so that Bessemer process and that new technology that went to Johnstown and Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Birmingham was not what we did at Catoctin. So after 1903, the furnace basically shifted from being a furnace to other modes of trying to make a living, like making paint or making barrel staves. But that was the legacy of the furnace. But during the bicentennial, now nearly 50 years ago, the legacy of Catoctin that was the narrative was European American. And that's understandable, because the people living in the village, the descendants of the people who replaced the enslaved, skilled African Americans, were still there, still in the small worker houses, still attending the church, still going to the little store that was the village center. And so that legacy, that narrative, was European American. And Catoctin Furnace lacked a memory, a collective memory that included the African American population. In northern Frederick County, our research has shown that by approximately 1910, there were fewer than 5 African American families in the North County, 1 in Lewistown, several in Emmitsburg, connected with the Catholic Church and the Catholic colleges, but none in Catoctin Furnace or the nearby town of Thurmont. So as I said earlier, in 1972, the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society began. It began because of the roadway threat to the village and the ruins of the furnace stack, Isabel. And the founders used the very young, at that point, Section 106 legislation from the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 to ask, or well, should we say make, the State Highway Administration of Maryland undertake cultural resource surveys of the new alignment. And it was in that that alignment survey that the archaeologists found the cemetery and began the excavation that resulted in the recovery of the excavation of 35 graves and the recovery of 32 individuals. So my background, I was not involved in that excavation. I was, not an archaeologist at that point. Still, younger. But at that point, that's when the excavation took place, and the remains were taken to the Smithsonian as the repository that could take care of them, steward them, and they remain there to this day. So my archaeology background, when I became involved in Catoctin as the next generation, was that I knew from my public archaeology background what could be done. And so started in 2012 searching for funding, and began in 2015 the reanalysis of the remains that had been found in 1979. And we started with an article called Recovering Identity in 2017. And then in 2020, we were able to sequence the genomes. In 2021, we worked with the Smithsonian to produce a documentary called Forged in Slavery. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, it's really an amazingly well-researched, documented a narrative about the enslaved at Catoctin. And then in 2022, we were able to release the genome. And in 2023, just exactly a year ago right now, we were able to meet the first direct descendant of the workers at Catoctin. So when we began this idea of, what could the technology of the 21st century tell us that the technology of the 20th century, when the excavation and the first analysis took place, what had changed and what could be added at this point? And the answer is a great deal. The excavation that was done in 1979 was, by the standards of the day, an excellent recovery excavation. And so we had that base with which to build upon. So working with the Smithsonian, we put together a request for sampling and analysis. And whenever you do that, there has to be a public good. So what was the public good here? And of course, the answer was, finding and connecting people who heretofore had not been able to make their connection to these skilled enslaved ironworkers. That was the goal. So in the first round of genomes, we were 100% successful with the sequencing, which was well beyond what we, in our wildest dreams. So then we were able to do 15 additional analyses, ending up with 29 genomes, of which 27 were then able to be sequenced, and 22 have at this point been compared. I show you this analysis from the first round of sampling because, for instance, we were able to see that some of the children, through DNA, we could now determine their gender. And that was something that, of course, when you're just looking at the skeletal remains, as good as you are as a forensic anthropologist, it's impossible to tell if an infant is male or female. So the technology that DNA allowed, the results that the DNA allowed us go beyond just the haplogroups, but they also give us information, very detailed information in other aspects. The cemetery at Catoctin that was found as part of this extension of the Route 15 roadway in the late 1970s, is shown here. And you can see the graveyard geography is basically the best way to phrase it. The families that are related here are nuclear families, mothers, children, aunts, and uncles. There are, interestingly enough, very few men. We're not sure why. We have a couple theories that we're working on. One is that these burials were most likely conducted by Moravian ministers. In the Moravian religion, men, women, children are all buried separately. They're not buried together as families. So it's possible that this graveyard geography is indicating that the men are buried somewhere else. There is a portion of the cemetery that is extant. It has never been disturbed. So that is one possibility. We know where those graves are because we did ground penetrating radar, but there is absolutely no intention of excavating or disturbing them in any way. But this gives you an idea of the 5 families that we were able to identify in the cemetery. Some are also some of the relationships that we see show us that there is a disease factor here. Sickle cell anemia is present in at least one family, and unfortunately in several members of that family. So one of the things that we realized was that we wanted to take the technology that was available now even farther. And so we found a grant that would allow us to make forensic facial reconstructions of 2 of the individuals. And we selected a young boy, he's 15 years old, and a mother who's about 32 or 33 years old. Those 2 that we selected, when I spoke with the archaeologist who was in charge of the excavation in 1979, she told me that those were the 2 she would have selected, which was just an amazing thing to hear from her. But this boy, at the age of 15, already had a compressed vertebrae from repetitive, hard labor, possibly mining, hammering with a pick, or lifting or chopping wood continually. But whatever it was hard, repetitive labor that at the age of 15 had already compressed his vertebrae. The mother had a condition that caused her to limp for her entire life. So every step, we suspect, would have been painful. She was buried with her infant above her. He lived a few months after she died, and her death likely occurred during childbirth. And her brother, who is a toddler, is also buried next to her. So just a heartbreaking family unit there in the cemetery at Catoctin. And the young man's sister is buried also a teenager. We have a very high incidence of teenagers in the cemetery, which is somewhat surprising because in a population, the teenagers are young and strong. You expect older people to be in the cemetery and neonates because the younger and smaller you are, the more vulnerable you can be to early death. But at Catoctin, these teenagers are buried at a very high percentage. And so we think it's emblematic of not enough rest, not enough nutrition, and just backbreaking work, which the bones also show us, of course. So why did we partner with 23andMe? As I said earlier, we started with ancestry.com, but the 23andMe database includes data from over 10 million individuals who have actively consented to participate in the research. 4.6 million in the US, 17,000 in Africa, and 260,000 in Europe. And more than 600,000 participants with greater than 5% African ancestry in the US. So this is a very large database that we were able to marry this ancient DNA to. So what type of genetic signal were we looking for? So here is a diagram showing like where you are, and the DNA at the bottom of the screen, that's you, and your DNA is in a particular sequence on the strands. So if you look at your father, the DNA is in the same place, and your uncle and your paternal grandfather. So we were looking for identical DNA, identical by descent, in the same location on the strand. So you, your father, and your uncle share identical DNA at the same position. That is the key here to this new protocol of identical by descent. So close relatives share many long segments of identical DNA, and very distant relatives may share a single but short segment of that identical DNA. So one of the things that we want to do is connect people back to Africa. This transatlantic nostalgia, that's not my term, that's been coined by other researchers, is real. Where did these people, where were they stolen from and brought across the ocean? So we're looking for using the DNA to do, pardon me, I'm going to go back, to look for these connections to African ethno-linguistic groups. And that is a very important part of what we're doing. So the African ancestry of the Catoctin individuals, I'm focusing on two today. Burial 35, as I said, is this mom who's 30 to 35 years old. She's in genetic family D. She's 96% African and 4% European. And as I said earlier, her brother and her son are buried with her. She comes from the African ethnic group of Wolof and Fula. See how close they are geographically? And I have a reason for pointing this out. So we think she is a very recent arrival in Maryland because her ethno-linguistic groups are not spread throughout the continent of Africa. They're very closely geographically related. Our other individual that we're going to look at today is Catoctin Burial 15. He was 15 to 16 years old, a male. He's in genetic family C. And as I said, he's buried with his brother and his sister, and possibly his mother or sister. We're still working on that. He's 93% African and 7% European, and he comes from the ethno-linguistic groups of the Lulu and Congo, and again, very closely related geographically on the African continent. There's another individual I want to tell you about, a little neonate. He's less than a year old. He's male, and he's part of genetic family A. He's 88% African and 9% European, and he's there with possibly his first cousin, his mother, and her sons. But what's interesting about this little boy is that his ethno-linguistic groups, there are 9 of them. So they are spread. The continent of Africa is massive, and these ethno-linguistic groups are spread throughout. And so what we think is that his family had been in Maryland, or in what is now the United States, for a while, so that these groups that were being brought from different parts of Africa were intermarrying, and the result was this boy related to 9 ethno-linguistic groups. So we wanted to explore the connections to present day participants in the 23andMe database. Where are people living now who have a genetic connection to Catoctin? So the research participants in the East Coast and the Southern states are the most likely to share genetic connections with the Catoctin individuals. And this is not surprising because we see the greatest number in Maryland. And these connections, though, may be very distant because they may be tracing back in deep time or collaterally to shared ancestors in Africa prior to coming across the Atlantic Ocean. So the close participants, these are the 2,700, 2,975 very close grandfather, great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, the very close connections. The largest number, not surprisingly, is in Maryland. 30 close relatives out of greater than 20,000 participants. But interestingly enough, or maybe not, California has 19 close relatives. And what is really interesting about California is that there is a family in the greater LA basin, and that's as close because of the not being able to delve into personal information. We don't know who these people are, but they are directly related to the mother, burial 35. I mean, directly, like great, 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 great grandparent. So this mom has a 5th degree relative with 280 centimorgans of identical DNA in the greater LA basin. And of course, we would love to know who that family is. And we're hoping that they contact us, which would be the way it would have to work. So what does it mean to be genetically related to the Catoctin individuals? Here's you at the bottom. And this relative at the over on the right of the screen, the individual is your relative, but not your direct ancestor. So that's what we mean by, I'll go back to this, that's what we mean by collateral, a collateral relative. Still, that person is connected to Catoctin. It's just not a direct connection. An example of a family tree connecting a research participant who shares a 9th degree relationship with a member of Catoctin family A. So that person is connected to Catoctin family A, but again, not directly, but it is a connection. And so here is a connection in which you see that same 9th degree relative going back to their 5th great grandparents and tracing back to the 9 different African ethnic groups that I talked about with the little, the neonate. So that is a deep time connection to Catoctin. Again, still absolutely a connection. So through our partnership with 23andMe, we were able to localize the African ancestry of Catoctin individuals, identify genetic connections between Catoctin individuals and research participants in the 23andMe database, reconstruct detailed family pedigrees linking the Catoctin individuals to their closest living relatives, and identify direct descendants. So identifying the direct descendants has been just an amazing process. Burial 12, which is literally, or was, right up against the northbound lane of Route 15, we've been able to go back to the 1979 archaeology reports and identify exactly where this particular burial was located prior to its excavation. It consisted of a female child, and the grave was marked with a headstone and a footstone. Some graves have only a headstone, some graves had only a footstone, some had both. The child was buried in a coffin, and it was initially identified in the excavation 1.3 feet below the surface. The coffin had 25 cut nails and 5 screws that were covered as part of the excavation, and traces of shroud pins were identified. One was retrieved from the top of the head. And this is a drawing that the archaeologists made in 1979 at the time of that burial excavation of Burial 12. So we, through the 23andMe database, were able to find the family of this little girl. The Summers family discovered that their ancestor, they share more than 120 centimorgans. That's the highest that we have been able to connect at this point, because again, we haven't found we don't know who the California family are yet. And yes, Skip Gates did say it was a model of engagement to be emulated. The family was over the moon thrilled, the Summers family. They feel, and I can have their permission to say this, that for the first time, they understand that they are direct descendants of skilled iron workers. Before, they just thought slavery was in their family, but now they know of this direct connection. So we see multiple connections in what we call kinship archaeology. There is a collective kinship. This is how we started connecting people when we had no DNA research 13 years ago. We just threw open our door, if you will, and said to all African Americans, Catoctin is a place where you can, as a collective kinship, come and understand that you are related writ large to skilled ironworkers who built the industry, built the wealth and privilege of the owners, and really helped build the United States. Catoctin made cannonballs. We now know we made cannon. We finally, after searching for decades, found an order, a payment, actually, not an order, but a payment for cannon to James Johnson for a Philadelphia ship during the Revolution. So we finally have that. What these skilled ironworkers contributed to the United States is just an amazing story to be told. And so we embrace that. We want everyone to embrace that as a collective kinship to Catoctin and to that industry. And of course, as I said, there's a deep time kinship to Africa, going back hundreds and even thousands of years, but it's still a connection. And there's a collateral kinship, relationships through a brother or a sister or a family relative who didn't actually come to Catoctin, but is related to someone who did. And then, of course, there's the direct kinship. So there are many types of kinship that we embrace and teach, if you will, share at Catoctin. So our kinship archaeology, we're reaching descendants through programs like this today. Thank you for allowing us this privilege of sharing this, returning results to people with at least 30 centimorgans of identical by descent. Now, the reason we have a cutoff of 30 centimorgans is because it is a level of centimorgans that is reliable, is the best way. It's not scattershot or it's a reliable level, 30 centimorgans. Yes, it's very high, but it's also it's solid is the best way to put it. Obviously, we're building community. That's what we want. We have a descendant communicator that was funded last year through NEH, and we're hoping to replicate that again this year. The descendants have weekly meetings. They have a monthly book workshop. They're working on a book to tell the story of their discovery. They have put together a society of friends of Catoctin that are descended from the skilled ironworkers. And we have finally, after 13 years, pulled together all the money to acquire the cemetery, which is still in private hands, and give it immediately to the state of Maryland. It will become part of Cunningham Falls State Park. That was our semi-quincentennial goal, and we met it 2 years prior. The settlement will be next month, so we're thrilled about that. So a huge team, as you can tell, amazing. The Smithsonian, Harvard, NEH, the Reich Laboratory, I can't say enough about them, 23andMe, of course, ARCH, our partner in Frederick County, the African American Research Cultural Heritage Society, the Maryland Historical Trust, and so many others. So thank you for allowing me to share this story, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this really important and informational presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to give folks a few extra minutes to put in questions. And while they do that, I wanted to ask a quick question for you around, you kind of touched on this in your presentation, but as far as hold on just a second. As far as when you're contacting individuals through 23andMe, is that something that has to, is there some kind of outreach that you all are doing once you identify a descendant? Or is that something that comes through has to come from the descendants themselves once someone is identified?
That is a great question. That has been sort of one of the things that has taken this process so long. Not the only thing, but we cannot access any personal data for any of these individuals. Absolutely, full stop. We cannot. So we use the power of social media, presentations like this, to let people know that if they're interested in finding out if they're connected using this identical by descent protocol, then they can join if they haven't already joined 23andMe. If their profile is already in 23andMe, they can reach out to us. 23andMe will tell them if they are what we call a significant match. That is one of the 2,900 plus individuals, or if they are a related person that's part of the 49,000. So 23andMe will tell them, but only after they say, we'd like to know this information, is the best way to put it. On the 23andMe profile that one has, if you are a significant match, you will find that out. So we cannot access that information.
Yeah. So this is a great way to get the word out. So definitely we're glad that we were able to, be a voice for that, and hopefully this will get that out into the community.
Yeah, the personal privacy part of this is critical because, some people may want to know and some people may not want to know. So this is totally, totally out of our hands. Just want to make that very clear.
Yeah. We had a question that says, do you have a project on GED match? I believe that is for this.
Yes, our descendant group, which is working very hard. They have GEDmatch. They work on various together. They work on their genealogy. They have weekly meetings. They're making connections and using GEDmatch as well.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Forgive me if you already touched on this, but are there any plans to reinturn the original remains that were excavated and are now at the Smithsonian?
The answer to that is that likely. We are the Friends group that has just made that they've gotten their 501c3 and gotten themselves totally organized. They are going. We're purchasing the cemetery next month with the help of the France Merrick Foundation and the African American Heritage Preservation Fund. Those two funding organizations very generously gave Catoctin Furnace Historical Society the money to purchase the cemetery, which will then, as I said, immediately be deeded over to the state of Maryland to be managed jointly by the state of Maryland, Department of Natural Resources, Cunningham Falls State Park, and the African American Descendant Friends Group. And so the decisions like those, what happens to the individuals, will the cemetery, will there be an interpretive wayside or contemplative space built at the edge of it? What will that management of the cemetery will be up to the descendants and the state of Maryland.
That's wonderful. So many comments thanking you for your talk today and the very important material that you've covered. So thank you again, Elizabeth, for this informative and engaging presentation. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland for Century Project. And thank you to Gateway Interpreting for providing accessibility for today's program. And lastly, thank you so much to our audience for joining us this afternoon. Stay safe, everyone. Take care and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.